This is for Palestine, Ramallah, west of Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. This is not just a war over stolen land. Why do you think little boys are being stones attacked? And we'll never really know how many people are dead. They shot phones on innocent girls while they sleep in their bed. Israel is a terror state, they're terrorists that terrorize. I'll testify on television, televise them telling lies. How many more resolutions have to be violated? How many children have to be annihilated? Is systematic genocide for whatever they try. Palestine will never die. Free, free Palestine. Free, free Palestine. Free, free Palestine. Free, free Palestine.
Hello, I'm Chris Williamson and you're watching Palestine Declassified, broadcasting twice a week. We're the only TV show that's dedicated to investigating and exposing the Israeli regime's global war against solidarity with the illegally occupied people of Palestine. In today's show, we'll be asking why the Zionist lobby and US warmongers are so exercised by who owns TikTok. Latif Abou-Chakra has discovered some surprising information about who TikTok has appointed to influential positions within the company, and she's filed this report.
A combination of US warmongers and Israel lobbyists are pushing the idea that because TikTok is owned by a Chinese company, it must be spying on and manipulating young people into, amongst other supposedly deplorable things, supporting Palestinians against genocidal Zionism. Well, TikTok, rather than being a hub of Chinese espionage, seems to be packed to the rafters with former US intelligence and NATO employees. Content policy lead for TikTok Canada, Alexander Corbeil, is simultaneously the vice president of the NATO Association of Canada. Ayche Kochak spent 3 years at NATO before becoming global product policy manager at the company at TikTok. Feature policy manager Greg Anderson worked on psychological operations for NATO until 2019. Bo Pateson has been working as a threat analyst for TikTok's Trust and Safety division. Previously, Pateson was a targeting analyst for the CIA. Victoria Makalo previously worked for the Department of Homeland Security and for the White House. She now works on trust and safety at TikTok. There are many more. The latest escalation on TikTok began in the early stages of Israel's Gaza genocide, when a recording of Jonathan Greenblatt, head of the lobby group and spy agency ADL, was leaked. In it, he lamented what he called the Gen Z and TikTok problems. This was a clear signal that the genocide lobby was joining the anti-TikTok campaign. Now the US Congress has issued a warning that TikTok must be purchased by a US company within 6 months or be banned from the country. Pro-Israel former Trump official Steve Mnuchin is gathering investors under his umbrella to buy TikTok. It is unclear if the investors will include his close friend Yossi Cohen, former director of Mossad, whom Mnuchin previously asked to join his other investment fund for Arab states. If the US was concerned about espionage against it and the protection of data, surely Larry Ellison's Oracle would not store key classified Defense Department data. Ellison did, after all, offer Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu the directorship of the company, and is also one of the largest donors to the Israeli occupation forces in history. Nancy Pelosi even went so far on CNN as to state that Benjamin Netanyahu attempted to interfere in the US elections. The United States does have a threat to its sovereignty, but it isn't from China.
Joining me in the studio, as usual, is our resident expert, David Miller. David's an academic and a former professor at Bristol University, and is now a senior research fellow at the Centre for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zayem University. He's also a co-director of the lobbying watchdog Spinwatch, and he's a leading British scholarly critic of Israel. Our guest contributor today is the celebrated British-Iraqi hip-hop artist Loki. He hosts the Watchdog podcast for Mint Press News that investigates secretive organisations and powerful vested interests. He's also a regular contributor on other media outlets like Double Down News. In recent years, he's gained a reputation as a cerebral commentator on international affairs in general and the crisis in Palestine in particular. And he's joining us today from London via Skype. Welcome to the show. David, why is it, do you think, that who owns TikTok, it sort of enrages both the United States hawks and the Israelis so much?
Well, the main reason, of course, is because young people use it, and young people are, in particular, virulently pro-Palestine. And that's what they don't like. They can't stand the fact that that overwhelmingly, if you look at TikTok, the messages that you get are pro-Palestine. There's hardly any, by comparison, pro-Israel messages, despite the best efforts, one, of the Israelis in trying to flood it with messages, and two, TikTok itself in trying to regulate the algorithm. So it's because they are losing on TikTok. So of course they have to find a way to explain that, and the way to explain that is say, oh, it's the Chinese. Chinese doing this. No, it's not the Chinese. We know it's the State Department people who are running it. People from the high echelons of the American national security apparatus are in there. That's been shown conclusively. So what they don't want is for there to be a massive outpouring of pro-Palestine content on social media, and they can't regulate it because it's done by young people who they don't understand and can't control.
And yet they've said, haven't they, that it's got to be bought by an American company, haven't they?
It's already not owned by a Chinese company. The whole thing is an absurdity.
Yeah, it's really strange, isn't it? Anyway, but low-key, it's not only those supporting Palestine, is it, who actually use TikTok?
Well, Israel now finds itself in an interesting position because on one hand, it incentivized and encouraged its soldiers to do TikTok videos, quote unquote, thirst trap videos, to try and beautify the image of the Israeli occupation forces. But what that led to also was Israeli military personnel sharing evidence of their own war crimes on the app, which were then entered into the ICJ submission for South Africa. And so in a way, it's a double-edged sword for Israel. On the other hand, what they also saw was people across the world using it to unpick the propaganda that Israel was pumping into the atmosphere. And TikTok, it was argued by Israel lobbyists, was somehow advantaging or algorithmically encouraging pro-Palestinian content, when actually those that attempt to use TikTok will find quite the opposite is true. Many pro-Palestinian accounts have been banned from TikTok with very little explanation.
Well, David, I mean, Latifa there mentioned the Anti-Defamation League in her report, otherwise known as the ADL. I mean, this organisation, we've mentioned it on the show numerous occasions. I mean, they pop up all over the place, don't they?
Well, I mean, people talk about how AIPAC buys political candidates in the US. Well, the AIPAC isn't the only element of the Israel lobby. The ADL is a key element, has been for over a century now. And it's a spy agency. It's there to spy on pro-Palestine protesters or Muslims or anyone who is critical of the state of Israel, and sometimes even those who were critical of the state of South Africa under apartheid were spied upon by the ADL. So it's there to sabotage pro-Palestine movements, and of course it's what it's doing in relation to TikTok. It's trying to encourage this idea that this is a Chinese company or that it's too pro-Palestine and to try and undermine it. So it's the spy wing, the sort of open spy wing of the Israel lobby in the US.
Well, Loki, what kind of methods then did the ADL use to pressure TikTok?
I think it's important to understand that the line is not clear where the ADL begins and the US security state ends. So the ADL is very much a product, though it has far deeper roots, of course, but in its present manifestation, a product of the bilateral security state between the US and Israel. It has a revolving door between it and the FBI. Several high-ranking figures in the ADL have come directly out of the FBI. And in fact, James Comey, at the time the head of the FBI, said the relationship between them and the ADL has never been closer. The ADL is actually the largest non-governmental trainer of law enforcement in the US. But the way that they mobilized around TikTok was very interesting. They made use of well-known Hollywood Islamophobe Sacha Baron Cohen, who has for many years been involved in the making of films which have buttressed the stereotypes that alienate Muslims across the Western world. But they mobilized him and sent him to TikTok to try and bully the platform and threatened them with this allegation that TikTok was responsible for the greatest increase in anti-Semitism since the Nazi regime of World War II. Patently false, complete rubbish. And of course, the ADL benefits from very close relationships with the creme de la creme of Hollywood and US celebrity, the US celebrity world. But they are also in a situation where they are becoming increasingly desperate when faced with the wave of pro-Palestinian feeling in the shadow of the Zionist genocide in Gaza.
Well, of course, the ADL were involved in a similar shakedown, weren't they, against Elon Musk?
Yeah, there was a sort of backwards and forwards, wasn't there? They sort of threatened Elon Musk with this advertiser boycott, and advertising revenues precipitously declined. And Musk then went to Israel with Netanyahu and came back and said he was very impressed by all that, and then started to make moves in the Zionist direction. But he also said that he wasn't going to give in to this advertiser boycott, which he was meaning the ADL's boycott. And there was a sort of another bit of to and fro, and then of course he gave in, and there's been various signs that they are that X, or Twitter as it used to be called, have been giving in to Zionist demands and implementing those demands across the platform.
Well, Loki, I mean, how does all this fit into the wider war against China then?
Well, the United States has 400 military bases situated around China. It has US forces on an island controlled by Taiwan that is just a few miles from the Chinese border. They have been constantly elevating the propaganda against China in the US media, and they have been seeking to take measures to build sacrificial lambs throughout the West. Of course, China is the number one trading partner for the vast majority of Western countries, including this one and including the United States. What this is about is the US being the number one producer in the world for over 100 years, and then that mantle moving to the Chinese. But of course, we have to remember that before the founding of the East India Company and the initiation of the British Empire, which spanned at its zenith over 14 million square miles of the planet, both China and India represented a an exponentially larger percentage of global production than the United States or Britain ever did. And so actually the British Empire established a sort of disfigured global order in which this tiny place was able to use other territories in the world, not only for captive labor, but also for free resources and also captive markets. And so it was that way that you had the development of Anglo-Saxon supremacy throughout the world. But China is pushing back the clock on all of that, and the world is returning to a more natural economic equilibrium. So the United States is doing everything it can to try and push that back, with the US military industrial complex leading the way. So TikTok fits in very clearly into that order of events, and it is really swept up as a moral panic, this idea of TikTok corrupting children for one, but also TikTok supposedly being a site of foreign espionage.
Yeah. No, indeed. Well, look, we'll come back to our discussion in a moment, because we've got another report now about TikTok's links to a pro-Israel company, which in turn is linked to the CIA.
The idea that China is spying on US citizens via TikTok becomes even more ridiculous when you discover that the data gathered by the company in the United States has actually been diverted to pro-Israel CIA cutout company Oracle as part of a massive deal known as Project Texas. The Oracle company was founded by Larry Ellison in 1977. The firm adopted the name of a CIA operation, and the first service it provided was helping the intelligence agency build a database. Oracle later hired David Carney to head its Information Assurance Center. Carney had previously been the third highest ranked employee at the CIA, where he had worked for 32 years. Today, Oracle is the world's second biggest IT software company, and Larry Ellison is the seventh richest person in the world. He is still the top shareholder in Oracle and works as the chief technology officer, as well as sitting as the executive chairman of the company, despite passing the role of CEO to Israeli Safra Katz. Larry Ellison was also instrumental in Elon Musk's bid to buy Twitter, providing him with $1 billion to pursue his takeover. Less well known is the closeness of Ellison and, in fact, the whole company to Israel. Over a period of a decade, Ellison donated over $26 million to the Israeli military. The current CEO of Oracle has explicitly stated the company's pro-Israel bias. Safra Katz exclaimed, "We're not flexible regarding our mission, and our commitment to Israel is second to none. If our employees don't agree with our mission to support the state of Israel, then maybe we aren't the right company for them. Larry and I are publicly committed to Israel." The extent of the company's relationship with Israel is even more clearly seen in the report that Ellison even offered Netanyahu the position of director at Oracle. Project Texas also led to an influx of agents from the U.S. security state into TikTok, like Rebecca Pober, who went from her post at the Pentagon to become a U.S. policy manager at TikTok. The company's head of data public policy for Europe is Jade Nestor, who was the State Department's Director of Internet Public Policy. Another interesting individual at TikTok is recruiting coordinator Katrina Villacisneros, who was part of Army Cyber Command, the U.S. military unit that oversees information warfare online.
I see Larry Ellison was mentioned in that report there, David. Just say a word or two, will you, about him and his links to Israel?
Well, you couldn't make this up, could you? I mean, this is the seventh richest person in the world who runs the second biggest IT firm in the world, and the company says that it will not even tolerate employees who think differently about the Zionist entity, and they can go elsewhere and work for another company. And the process by which they are involving themselves with TikTok is the process that they've done in many other companies. They have massive contracts, of course, in the UK as well. And what we see then is that the data which they are managing for in these contracts are this data which is clearly available to Israeli intelligence. So this is a massive, massive scandal. And whenever we talk about this kind of thing, people say, "Oh, this is nothing." But this is a real scandal. That actually, this is an Israeli intelligence operation to penetrate the data systems of the largest organizations in the world, including governmental organizations which have a national security component. The fact that they're now penetrating TikTok as well as many other companies, and that they're putting in place people who are ex-US spies and from the US national security apparatus is truly astonishing. But you won't find this in the mainstream media at all.
I was going to say, where is the corporate media then?
Nowhere.
How would you explain that? I mean, it's very odd, isn't it?
I mean, that's a much longer answer you asked me to do. But the media, of course, are structurally opposed
as we've actually touched on in previous shows. But Loki, how does Oracle then go about obtaining contracts here in the UK?
Well, the interesting thing about Larry Ellison is that he is also a component of the campaign against Elon Musk and Twitter, because, of course, he borrowed Elon Musk $1 billion in order to buy the platform. In addition to that, Larry Ellison is so close to Benjamin Netanyahu that even though Ellison is supposed to be a prosecution witness in the eternally delayed corruption trial that Netanyahu must undergo when he's finished genocide in Gaza, Ellison has met with Netanyahu several times on his private Hawaiian island, and he even saw to it that his own lawyer and the lawyer of Israeli intelligence agent Arnon Milchan, another supposedly prosecution witness in the trial, was given to Benjamin Netanyahu for the trial. So all manner of corruption and conflict of interest seem to be at play here. In terms of domestically, Oracle stores the data for the British Ministry of Defence, for the Home Office, for the British Foreign Office, and even for the British National Health Service. Now, the very month that Larry Ellison's company obtained this massive contract with the British government, you had the cancelling of Larry Ellison's Ellison Foundation charity, which operated here and employed the father-in-law of Boris Johnson, who was at the time the Prime Minister, as its head. And Boris Johnson's father-in-law received £500,000 wage per year from Larry Ellison's charity, at the same time that Ellison was employing other British government high-ranking employees. At the same time, he was vying for a contract from the British government. To me, that's an open and shut case of conflict of interest.
Well, a bit of a rhetorical question now then, David, but do you think any of the data that we've discussed is safe in the hands of Larry Ellison and Oracle?
Well, I mean, from the outside, you can say that obviously people will be sceptical of that.
Yeah,
but you know, what do we have? Do we have any kind of due diligence from the Ministry of Defence, from the Foreign Office, from the Home Office? These are, of course, the three government departments in the UK which are responsible for all of the intelligence operations of the British state, for GCHQ, MI5, MI6, and all the rest of the military intelligence as well. So this is an open and shut case of a national security problem, which the national security establishment of the UK steadfastly refuses to face. It simply won't look at it, and you've had what effectively are massive bribes to senior civil servants and indeed to the former the Prime Minister's father-in-law. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation. There should be a public inquiry in this in the UK, but there's not a whiff of it anywhere in public debate.
No, indeed. So, I mean, it's not only the media falling down on the job, but the politicians who are supposed to be holding these sort of organisations to account.
And the intelligence agencies. The intelligence agencies should be leading an investigation of this.
Sure, indeed. Well, Loki, I mean, are we seeing an antagonism developing, do you think, in the relationship between China and Israel?
Well, this is a fascinating question, Chris, because immediately after October 7th, the Chinese government refused to condemn the operation. In addition to that, Israel, since the beginning of its genocidal campaign in Gaza, has charged that China is unofficially operating sanctions against Israel on the dual-use civil and military exports, which normally are sent from China to Israel because they just haven't been coming in. Now, supposedly, there is a bureaucratic reason behind it, but Israel is convinced that China is targeting it. In addition to that, when Israel cancelled the work permits of 65,000 Palestinian construction workers in the aftermath of the Al-Aqsa flood operation, what you saw was Israel seeking to fill that gap with 100,000 Chinese workers. The Chinese government then banned its citizens from going and working in Israel. We know that around 30,000 Chinese citizens were working in the Zionist entity prior to October 7th. At least 20,000 of them have left. And what we also know is that during this time, perhaps as revenge for the unofficial sanctions issue, you have seen the Israeli port of Haifa, which previously was controlled by a Shanghai corporation. The Chinese had invested a huge amount of resource in developing the Haifa port. It's now, during this period, fell 70% under the control of an Indian billionaire. So there certainly is some level of antagonism developing within the Israel and China dynamic, for sure.
Well, David, I mean, what sort of impact then do you think there would be with a kind of fallout in the relationship between China and Israel in the region there?
Well, we already know what some of the impacts have been. We already know that the Chinese brokered the deal between Iran and the Saudis, which also helped to end the conflict in Yemen, and put Ansarallah in the position of being able to enforce a boycott of an embargo on the Red Sea. We already know that the Chinese have been behind the overtures between the Syrian government and the Saudis, and indeed by Hamas and the Saudis, and indeed with Hezbollah and the Saudis. These are all massive changes in the region, which mean that the region is moving away from having to separately fight Israel, and indeed are moving in a direction which means that China will increasingly become to be seen on the side of what effectively is the resistance axis. Now, it's not doing that openly as yet, but the overtures it's making are having the consequence that actually fighting between the Arab nations is being decreased, and that of course means there will be probably an increased confrontation with the Zionist entity.
another indication perhaps of the end of the unipolar world and the emergence of the multipolar world, something we'll probably have to come back to on another show, because unfortunately we are right out of time for today. So thank you for watching, and thank you to our guest Low-Key, and of course our resident expert Professor David Miller. Remember, you can follow the show on Facebook, Twitter and Telegram, where we post regular clips and updates. You can also help us to counteract the disinformation peddled by the corporate media about Palestine and the resistance to the Zionist entity by sharing today's programme on your social media platforms. So until next time, when Palestine Declassified will be back with more forensic investigations and analysis, this is Chris Williamson saying bye for now.